Well, good afternoon, everyone, and I want to welcome you to our Bible study today. Hope that you're all doing well. We've got a beautiful day today. Those of you that are joining us online, we want to welcome you also. We're in our next to last installment of Exodus. So we'll make hay today and cover the construction of the tabernacle. And then next week we'll talk about how it's dedicated, and we'll complete our study of Exodus. So let me just remind you of where we are. You'll notice in your outline I've left this little intro in there for this little stretch, and the reason for that is it's a lot of repetitive material when you read through the instructions God gave Moses about constructing the tabernacle. They're very precise. It almost reads like an architect or someone who was very interested in the implementation of all this recorded it for us. And then we had that interlude with Israel at the foot of Mount Sinai. And then now we come to the actual construction of the tabernacle. And it's a lot of repetitive material. So we're going to start in chapter 36, verse 8. So here's what's happened. Moses has gotten the actual instructions about how to build the tabernacle. God has gifted the people. Remember, we talked about how we're not really sure what all they did in Egypt, but I'm sure they had all kinds of jobs working as slaves, and so they had certain skills. The Lord gave them the skills they needed. They had donated the materials, and so it was time to build. So these 3 chapters are about the actual construction of the tabernacle. And so let's just look at how it unfolds. It begins in verse 8 with just the building of the tent itself. And so the first thing they did was constructed the outer part of the tabernacle, if you will. And if you notice verse 8 of chapter 36, it says, all of those who were skilled among the workers made the tabernacle. So again, these are all going to be people who have definite skills to do various things. And there's all kinds of embroidery work that had to be done. If you look at verse 14, the specific instructions about even the actual, all the materials, goat hair and all those kinds of things, how many tent pieces there had to be, all the poles, all the rings, everything that mattered in terms of understanding exactly how to construct it is given to them in specific detail. They're told how wide it's supposed to be, how tall it's supposed to be, how long it's supposed to be, and the kind of the acacia wood that they're supposed to use. And so it's interesting because we know that later the temple is going to be this incredibly important building in the life of Israel, and it's going to be built on holy ground, and it's going to serve to be at the heart of the theology of Israel for the rest of its history. It's even the place today where the temple was built in Jerusalem is holy ground, and some of y'all have been to Jerusalem, and you know how contested that little piece of property is. You know, there are all kinds of laws and rules and things you can do on the Temple Mount and things you can't do. When we were there, we had a guide who was with us, but he was actually a Messianic Jew. And so it was a little dicey for him because he technically was not allowed on the Temple Mount because he's Jewish, and it's under Palestinian control. And so he had, because of the missionary we were with, had a special pass. He was able to go with us, but he told us, I just can't talk to you while we're on this Temple Mount, because if they catch me and they find out I'm Jewish, well, then I'll be in incredible trouble. So there's that little section in Jerusalem that if you're a Jew, you're not allowed to actually visit. So it's kind of a fascinating blend of religions and relationships there on the Temple Mount. You know that the Jews are allowed on the side of the Temple Mount where the Wailing Wall is, where they go to pray, and they have all kinds of worship services and ceremonies there. But here's what I was going to say. As sacred as all of that is, and as important as it's been historically, and how theologically it's been woven into the theology of Israel, there are even some Christian theologians who weave the temple into their own theology and eschatology. And what's fascinating is you get more instructions in the Scripture and more detail on how to build the tabernacle than you do the temple. So it's quite fascinating how much time is given in the book of Exodus to building this temporary structure that is going to travel with Israel, but one day will be replaced by a much more permanent structure that becomes a theologically important entity. And we get more instructions about this one than we do that one. But there's a lot of similarities, so maybe that's why that's the case. But regardless, this construction project is outlined for us in incredible detail. So I just kind of walked you through the outline as it's outlined in the text. So if you just look at it, the tabernacle itself is constructed, and you get to the end of chapter 36 and chapter 37, you have obviously the single most famous piece of furniture in the tabernacle is described. So look at chapter 37, verse 1. Bezalel made the ark of acacia wood, 2.5 cubits long, 1.5 cubits wide, and 1.5 cubits high. He overlaid it with pure gold, both inside and out, and made a gold molding around it. He cast 4 rings for it and fastened them to its 4 feet with 2 rings on one side and 2 rings on the other. He made the poles of acacia wood, overlaid them with gold. He inserted the poles into the rings on the sides of the ark to carry it. He made the atonement cover of pure gold, 2.5 cubits long and 1.5 cubits wide. Then he made the 2 cherubim out of hammered gold at the ends of the cover. He made one cherub on one end and the second cherub on the other. At the 2 ends he made them of one piece with the cover. The cherubim had their wings spread upward, overshadowing the cover with them. The cherubim faced each other, looking toward the cover. Well, this particular piece of furniture is going to be the most famous piece of furniture in the history of Israel. This is where God is going to meet Israel. This is where the presence of God will appear. And you know that eventually what's going to happen is only the high priest will be allowed to go into the place where this particular piece of furniture is housed. And that priest can only go in there one day a year, on the Day of Atonement, where the blood of a goat will actually be placed on that mercy seat, if you will, on that seat of atonement, that cover, to atone for the sins of Israel. And y'all remember there'll be another goat that he will pray over and cast all the sins of Israel on that goat, and that goat will then be cast outside the camp. And that goat will be called the scapegoat. So I'm not sure whether it was better as a goat to be killed or to have all the sins of Israel put on your head. I'm not sure which one would be better, but regardless. So this little piece of furniture, it's interesting how it's described very simply in this text. It's constructed exactly how God told them to do it, and it's going to become this incredibly famous entity that will become a part of the history of Israel. Even to this day, there's still debate about the Ark of the Covenant, and there are people who believe it still exists, and there are folks who think that it is in Ethiopia today, and there's a group of priests who protect it, and so it's had a fascinating journey, as you know. Then as you start working your way outward, there will be the table that's constructed in Exodus 37, beginning in verse 10. And then the very famous lampstand in chapter 37, beginning in verse 17. The altar of incense, which is different from the altar of the burnt offering. All of those altars are going to be constructed. And remember, the principle is the closer you get to the Holy of Holies, the more precious the metal had to be. As you make your way from the Holy of Holies, you can use less precious metals. So by the time you get to the entrance of the tabernacle, you can use bronze or copper. As you make your way to the Holy of Holies, you can only use gold, then eventually silver as you make your way through the tabernacle. Then you have maybe one of the most interesting statements in this entire narrative found in chapter 38, verse 8. Right next to the altar, a burnt offering, there had to be a basin for the priests to wash themselves so that they could maintain their purity. It was both a practical thing and a symbolic thing as they were offering up sacrifices for Israel. But you have this very interesting statement that has left us all puzzled. So it says in verse 8, they made the bronze basin and its bronze stand from the mirrors of the women who served at the entrance to the tent of meeting. Now that is a fascinating little sentence, and that's all Moses says. So you can only imagine how much ink has been spilled by people trying to figure out what in the world does this mean, okay? And it's filled with all kinds of intrigue because Hebrew is not a precise language, all due respect to Hebrew. Hebrew is primarily built, the words are built upon 3 consonants, typically. And so, consequently, the words that the Hebrew people use often are pregnant with meaning. In other words, they have various meanings depending upon the context in which they're used. So even the word mirror is mentioned there. If you'll see that in verse 8, that word has a lot of similarity to the word for life in Hebrew, which is quite fascinating. And so evidently mirrors were viewed as special instruments in the ancient world. We know that to be true among the Egyptians. Not so sure about that with the Jews, but evidently women carried them. And the mirrors were usually polished bronze or polished copper. They weren't glass like you and I think of today as mirrors. They weren't quite that effective. But they had some special role in people's lives. Well, these women donated them. That's one thing. So just the idea that they donated it specifies they didn't just donate the bronze. They donated the bronze from mirrors. But then you have this other phrase, who served at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and then were never told again what they did. So what did these women do at the tent of meeting, or the tabernacle? Why did they do it, and who were they? Well, that's a really good question. Later, Eli's boys are going to get in trouble in 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 22. You can look at that later. But his boys are going to get in trouble because they became so evil, they actually began to engage in sexual relations with the women who were at the entrance of the tabernacle. So that's led some scholars to question, okay, did these women serve at the entrance of the temple? Were they influenced by pagan worship? Because y'all are astute enough to know, you've read enough biblical history to know that the women who served at the entrances to the temples of Baal, remember why they were there? Many of them were sacred prostitutes, is what they were called. Now, there's zero evidence that ever happened in Israel. We know there's no connection to that in Israel. However, there is this text that lets us know, and they're mentioned again in 1 Samuel. Now, again, the Hebrew word there that's translated in the NIV is translated the women who served. Some of y'all's translations might say ministered, or some of your translations might say guarded. All of those words can translate that Hebrew word. That Hebrew word has military connotations. Sometimes it's used to describe military guards. Sometimes it's used to describe people engaged in ministry. And so the NIV has chosen to just use a word that tries to capture all of that, served, and they served at the entrance. Well, why did they serve at the entrance of the tabernacle? Well, if you think about it, let's just do a little conjecture, okay? We know they're not temple prostitutes or sacred prostitutes. That's something that's going to be condemned specifically, so that we know that's not it. But here's what we do know, that entering into the tabernacle was considered a holy act. So if you'll just, in your reading, if you'll just notice when you're reading particularly the book of the law, how many times entry to the tabernacle is mentioned. It'll be mentioned many times in the book of the law. Who can enter? When can you enter? What are the stipulations that keep you from entering? And there are all kinds of things that cause people to be impure. And so there are some scholars who say these women were there to help engage the worshipers to make sure that they were qualified and able to actually make their way in to give the sacrifice to the priest. That they had some kind of guardian role, if you will. Or maybe they also were there just to serve the priest as they engaged in their work. Maybe they were there to help in the process of cleaning, whether it had to do with the people who were making their way in for purity or it had to do with the work of the priest inside the actual tabernacle itself. We're not really sure, but we do know there was a role for them. Now, if you think about that, so the sense would be these are dedicated women who felt called to this particular role. You have a couple of examples in the Old Testament of women who were dedicated to certain roles. It's led some scholars to ask, could this be connected to work in the tabernacle? The bottom line is we don't know. But here's what we do know. Very early, we do know there were women who worked at the temple also, not just the tabernacle. So there's something about gaining entry into the presence of God had requirements associated with it. And these women evidently played some kind of role connected to it. So here's what we do know. If you'll fast forward after Christ comes and the church is established, you get to the latter part of the 2nd century and early in the 3rd century, and there are men who are feeling called to pull aside and not necessarily participate in the normal affairs of humanity and just serve the church and serve the interests of the kingdom of God. And when that happens, there's going to be a group of women who are going to do the very same thing. And so there are some people who would connect the history of these women who dedicate themselves to the service of the Lord for the rest of their lives and engage in a certain role in the life of the church, connect them to this particular example that was lived out in the life of Israel. So some people, there's no historical connection that I have been able to find, but there seems to be somewhat of a spiritual connection between the history of nuns and the history of these women who served at the tabernacle. Does that make sense? There's no historical link, but the idea that there is perhaps a role for women to do something in the service of the Lord that calls them to a place of dedication and service that could be, or at least some say could be, to this very story. It's fascinating to me that Moses says that and then he never mentions it again. And so evidently it was something well known to them and there was no need for him to explain it. Everybody knew why these women were serving. So he just mentions it. I find that fascinating sometimes. Anyway, but all that to say, we really don't know what they did or why they did it. There's not enough evidence. But we do know there was an abuse that took place later in 1 Samuel. And then you have, after that one little verse, which is quite fascinating, then you have the building of the courtyard. And then you get to verse 21, and Moses offers us a summary of all the materials. And I think that one of the reasons that he does that is it just demonstrates once again the importance of this building, this tabernacle, and also the incredible generosity of God's people who made it possible, and the fact that Israel actually was obeying God directly. This is what God commanded them to do. Now you get to chapter 39, and you turn a page, because here's the thing with the Jews in their original calling as a nation. They don't have a royal family. So as important as Moses is to them, he was not their king, and he would not be viewed as a king. And they're not going to have kings for a long, long time. So the priests are going to function as God's representatives to the people. So what's fascinating about that is God decides that their adornment is going to represent the important role they play in the life of the people. So how they dress is going to separate them from the rest of Israel. And the dress that's described in the book of Exodus does have some similarity to royal dress in the ancient world. You have this diadem where the Lord's name is printed on it. It's actually referred to as a crown in this text. You have these elaborate robes that are highly embroidered. Well, those were not the kind of clothes the typical Jew would wear on a daily basis. These are very special, ornate robes and clothes. And they also have special pieces that are a part of the symbolic representation of the presence of God in the role that the priests are going to play. So you've got the description in chapter 39 of the ephod, the breastpiece, and the vestments. Here's what's interesting about chapter 39 and chapter 40, both. If you'll notice, like if you look at the end of verse 5, you'll see, as the Lord commanded Moses. Y'all see that phrase? On this page, you'll find that phrase 7 times. Okay? And then when you get to page 40, you'll have that phrase 7 times. So, do y'all think that's accidental, coincidental? Well, no, it's not. It's incredibly intentional. Moses is describing something here that to him is a heavenly reality. And so you've got to pay attention to how you tell the story. And so he's using even the symbolism, if you will, of the number 7 and how sacred that was to the Jews already in their history this early on, even in the making of the vestments for the priests. So the ephod, the breastpiece. Moses doesn't tell us in this text about the crafting of the Urim and the Thummim, and the reason for that is most scholars say those were unfinished stones. So that they didn't make them, they found them, if you will. And then they were blessed by the priest and then used by God to give them direction and wisdom. And so you have this sevenfold statement about the commandment of God, and then you have this very interesting little conclusion, if you will, to chapter 39. So if you look at verse 42, it says, the Israelites had done all the work just as the Lord had commanded Moses. Moses inspected the work, and he saw that it was good. That's actually what the Hebrews communicating. He saw they had done everything they were supposed to do, and he blessed them. Now, does that sound familiar at all to any other thing we've already read? We've got 7 statements. Moses looks at it and says, okay, you've done everything you're supposed to do, and he blesses it. So what we've got in front of us is the story of creation retold, really. And almost every scholar I've read agrees with that. Moses reviews all the work, pronounces a blessing. It's done just like God had desired. So God creates everything, puts the universe in place. He blesses it. He sanctifies it. He creates humanity. He builds into it a rhythm of a 7-day week. On the 7th day, he rested. And then we go through the story of the rebellion of humanity, the fall of man, the flood, and then finally the Tower of Babel, where the people are scattered and they're no longer able to communicate with each other. And then God calls Abraham and tells Abraham, I'm going to use you to be a blessing to all the nations. And then if you fast forward several hundred years, we finally get to the place where now God has these people, and he's going to recreate them in his image, so to speak, so that they then can fulfill his will in creation. So that's the imagery that's at play here in this story. So there's more going on than just building a tent. They're building a tent. But we're going to read later in Hebrews that this is something that represents what's already constructed in heaven. And so with all that said, here are just some things real quickly to consider. One is the tabernacle will represent the reality of God's presence with his people. It's going to communicate his desire to fellowship with his people. You know, these people, they're not engaged as personally with God as you and I are. They didn't have the Holy Spirit within them, but they had a desire to know who he was and please him. And so the tabernacle demonstrates to them he's with them, and they're going to see the evidence of his presence. And we're going to talk about that next week when we get to Exodus 40. But it also demonstrates God is showing to Israel he wants to be with them. He doesn't want to be aloof from them. He wants them to know that they're his children. They're his people. And this communicates his desire to be with them. So everybody has a tent in the community. Now he has one. And so it's a very tangible, practical thing. And I believe it was a great gift from God. And then secondly, it offers the people of God a tangible place to meet, interact with, respond to, demonstrate devotion to, obey, love, publicly express their acknowledgement of Yahweh. Once they get these prescriptions, if you will, here's what I need you to do. Here's how I want you to engage me. Here are the festivals I want you to keep. Here are the sacrifices that I want you to give. Here's what I want to happen in the rhythm of your calendar. In other words, in every part of your life, I want you to acknowledge me. I want you to recognize what I've done for you. And so there are all these high and holy days that will be scattered throughout the calendar of Israel. And they're all going to be connected to what God's done for them. And then he's going to give them opportunities to actually come to his house and show him how much they love him and how they're willing to obey him. And they're going to do what he's asked them to do. And so it's a very tangible thing that the Lord is giving to Israel. Now, you and I Fast forward to, to the history of Christianity. When the church was first established in the New Testament, they didn't have a building to go to. Now, I want you to think about how challenging that was going to be for them theologically, because they were all Jews. And so if you were to ask a typical Jew in the first century, where does God live? Now, I believe a Jewish person who was astute theologically would say, well, God is God and He's sovereign and He's everywhere. But where does He live on earth? Well, in Jerusalem. That's where we go to meet Him. And I'm a Jewish man. I have to go there at least once in my lifetime. And so, of course, and we have a priest on our behalf who goes into the holiest place in that holiest building on the planet and offers up a sacrifice for us so that we can all stay in relationship with Him. Jesus comes, and the disciples are all standing around talking to Jesus one day, and you got this massive temple and temple compound that Herod has helped finish, and they all say, look how massive this is. I mean, as a matter of pride, they're living in the middle of a Roman Empire. They're Jewish people. They're proud that they have this place. And Jesus says, yeah, one day this will all be torn down. Now, you and I look at that and go, yep, that's what happened. They looked at that and said, what are you talking about? You can tear every building in Jerusalem down. You can't tear this one down. This is God's house, And Jesus is going to lead them to understand when you worship Him in spirit and truth. And God's looking for people to do that. So God is going to work with this revolutionary change through the teaching of Jesus, and He's going to completely change their theology so that they're going to have to learn that God no longer is just worshiped in that one building. And that is going to be an incredible transformation for them. And so if you say that to them, had I been there, my next question would have been, well, where's our building? Well, they didn't have one. And so the other model they already had by that time were the synagogues that were scattered all over the diaspora, all the places outside of Jerusalem where you could gather for worship. So they took that as their model, these early Christians did. Those small gatherings, you didn't have to be in Jerusalem. And eventually, guess what they're going to do? Out of those communities and out of those homes, they're going to construct places to gather for God's people all over. And it will then become for those early Christians that house to which you go to pay homage to Him, to worship Him, to show your obedience to Him, your love for Him, and gather with other believers who are doing the very same thing. That's led to what you and I do today. And so, we know that the church is not the building. We know that, right? But don't we all still believe, though, there's something about the sanctuary that's different for us than the gym? True? There's something about it. Well, what's that connected to? Well, it goes all the way back to this. There's just a sense that you want to be in the presence of God, and there are these places that we've set aside to where we can do that and meet together and be in His presence together and demonstrate our love for Him and our adoration of Him and experience Him corporately. And so when I read this story of the tabernacle, I have a lot of affinity for it because I have a desire to be in holy spaces. I just think it's an important thing. I don't believe it's magical. That's not the point. But there is a sense, though, that it's dedicated for something purposeful and intentional. And I believe it's connected to people in the ancient world who desired that. The Jews wanted it, and God answered that need. I believe He's done the same for us, okay? So third, the other thing I'd say about this, a couple other things real quickly. The tabernacle was also seen as the intersection between heaven and earth, because this is where God came down, so to speak. He came down and met Israel. You would see the smoke would fill the place. Just the glory of God would overwhelm them. He would give them His guidance. He would take them where they need to go through the wilderness. And so this was where heaven and earth came together. Now, what's fascinating about this particular building, as they build it, they have special instructions on how to move it. You got all those rings on all those pieces of furniture, all those poles, so you can practically put those poles Even the Ark of the Covenant's going to have rings that you can slide the poles through so that you can carry it. Here's how to cover it. Here's who can carry it. And so they're going to move it from place to place. Now, eventually, they're going to go into the Promised Land. And so when you get to the book of Joshua, the tabernacle is placed in Shiloh. Then if you just keep reading in the story of the Old Testament, Nob in 1 Samuel, the high priest, the priest had moved to Nob, so that meant the tabernacle had gone with them. You get to 1 Chronicles 16, it's been moved to Gibeon. But then finally, Solomon decides to bring all of it to Jerusalem. You know, David wanted to do that, if you remember. David had a great desire to build a house for God. And remember, the Lord told David that his hands were too bloody. You remember that story? So I'm going to let your son do it. And so Solomon was able to take that great treasury that David had collected, because David collected all this gold and treasury so he could build the Lord's house. He wasn't able to do it, but Solomon did. Well, in order to do that, he had to bring everything to Jerusalem. So they had to pack up everything in the tabernacle and move it. And once they moved it to Jerusalem, it was to never be moved again. And so the tabernacle disappears, if you will, during the reign of Solomon. But the ministry of the tabernacle goes on. And what's fascinating is, so you get many years later, and the Apostle John is, we believe he's older, probably around AD 90 or so. Matthew, Mark, and Luke have already written their stories. There's been all kinds of things shared about Jesus. The Apostle Paul has lived and died. All the other apostles have died. And John decides to write his story about Jesus. And he starts his story in creation. You remember, John starts his story by saying, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So John wants you to understand he's going to tell the story of recreation. That's why he starts his gospel with in the beginning. And then you get to verse 14, and John says in Greek, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. You know what the Greek word is? Tabernacle. So John is going to look at this story, and he's going to read into this that the tabernacle was a part of the recreation of humanity. And now he's going to tell his story through that very same lens fulfilled in Jesus. And he's going to say Jesus comes and he is going to tabernacle with us, just like God's always wanted to be with us. So if you're paying attention and you're willing to pay the price to spend some time with it all, it actually all connects together. The reason is because it's his story. It's his story, and he's in charge of it. And guess what he's doing with it? He's taking it to his end. And so we're somewhere on the journey. Someone asked me the other day, they said, man, I'm looking at the world, and is the world coming to an end? I said, well, here's what I know. Vanderbilt beat Alabama and Auburn in football. That should be a signal that this thing's about over, you know. But it's never happened in my lifetime. I don't think it's in Scripture anywhere, but I'm sure it's shocking to somebody. But, well, how would I know? I don't know. I know this story has a beginning and an ending. And I know we're one day closer to the ending and one day further away from the beginning, but I have no idea how far the ending is away. For all I know, it's way further away than the beginning. I'm not in charge of that. But I'm going to try to be faithful in the day I'm in. And I'm going to trust God with how he's going to bring it to a conclusion, because I know that's what he's doing. And it's not accidental. And so, all right, I'm going to stop right there. Online folks, bless you. We'll see you next week.